Hello everybody and welcome to the third webinar in the Ritman Library's Hermetically Open series. First one, just to remind you, was on Heinrich Kunrad of Leipzig and his Amphitheatre of Eternal Wisdom. Second one was on Michael Meyer and his Atalantafugians. This third one is on John Dee, with a particular focus on his Monas Hieroglyphica 1564. We're going to begin with a portrait of John Dee, in fact a very famous one that's in the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford. He was actually left there in 1692 at the death of Elias Ashmole. Is an oil portrait of Dee, aged 67 years old, looking extremely august with his long white beard, yes, described as an Englishman, in fact a Londoner. In fact, Londinensis is often what you have to look for if you're doing research on John Dee. You won't in Latin just find the Latin version of John Dee, but you actually have to look for the Londoner. Some people only refer to him as that. Anyway, that's one image of John Dee, a well-known one in the Ashmolean Museum. And I should point out that Elias Ashmole, who's one of the founding members of the Royal Society in England, was absolutely fascinated by Dee. At his death in 1692, he didn't just leave the painting, he left around 40 notebooks by or to do with the life of John Dee and his various works, with particular interest in his astrology, in his alchemy, his magic, but also in many other subjects. I should point out that John Dee is a polymath. For historians of science and mathematics, is one of his favoured works. It's his mathematical preface to the English translation of the Elements of Geometry of Euclid. Here's a well-known title page which includes, the gods and various famous people connected with geometry and mathematics. At the back is the ground plat, it gives you an idea. John Dee is famous as a mathematician in history of science, and here you can see he lists the purposes of arithmetic and geometry, and then a whole lot of different interests that he's concerned with. So for example, we have perspective, astronomy which is also astrology, music, cosmography, well, astrology there, and various other things. I mean, it is absolutely fascinating to see the different dimensions that he's invested in. He's very well known professionally, as it were, at the courts of Queen Elizabeth I and of King James as a teacher of mathematics, and an authority on the art of navigation, and the mathematical preface is a very good indication of that. Today, however, I'm focusing more on his astrology and his alchemy. I'm going to turn now to another image of him. This is from an early 18th century collection of alchemical works. It's the Deutsches Theatrum Chemicum, and volume 3 has this very nice portrait of John Dee. There he is, yes, with his globe, of course located is London and England. He's quite nationalistic, and the description is John Dee of London, most famous mathematician of the English, Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, born 13th of July 1527, died 1608 or possibly 1609. This is from the image from the collection of Friedrich Rothschultz, who produced this. That gives a different dimension. It's John Dee included in a whole collection of works on the history of alchemy. Okay. I'm going to show you one third image. It's from a book not published by Dee, published in fact in the 17th century by Merrick Sorbonne, who thoroughly disapproved of John Dee, but was very interested in John Dee's activities. This is for the most part, reliable record of John Dee's actions with spirits or conversations with angels that he carried out throughout his life, but particularly in the 1580s. Here we have a portrait of John Dee with the remark, Dee avowed his stone is brought by angelical ministry. Okay, the conversation with angels was on various subjects. It was on prophecy, but also it was on subjects like alchemy and Kabbalah. John Dee had a scryer, this person, Edward Kelly, being the best known scryer, meaning a clairvoyant, someone who stared into his crystal, allegedly still the crystal which is in the British Museum collection, yes, the angels came, conversed with Edward Kelly as the scryer, and Dee recorded the secrets. These records are still available in manuscript, Sloane 3188 in the British Library. You can go there and see the records in Dee's hand of that. Because Sorbonne, who was worried about atheism, the spread of atheism, the belief, the non-belief in the existence of God and the spiritual world. Even though he disapproved of Dee's activities, took them as a record of the existence of spirits. And if spirits exist, the spiritual world exists, God exists, and so atheism is refuted. So it's very strange to see, 17th century record of beliefs in spirits and belief in magical practice by someone who thoroughly disapproves of it. Anyway, Dee's third portrait, and another dimension of him. We've had the mathematical scientific dimension, we've had the alchemical dimension, this is more the magical dimension. Dee's alchemical career begins in around 1542, when at the age of 15 he enters St John's College, Cambridge, and begins his undergraduate studies. 4 years later he finishes his BA and becomes an underreader in Greek at the newly formed Trinity College, which has just been established by Henry VIII. There, one of the things that's passed down in history is the fact that he designed a mechanical beetle for a play of Aristophanes' The Piece, and it so shocked people when this beetle zoomed across the stage into the heavens that he was accused of witchcraft. And these sort of accusations sort of follow him through his life, even though that is a knowledge of mathematics which is really more mechanical than magical. Nevertheless, at the time it was perceived as magical. After 2 years he gets his MA and goes off to study at the University of Leuven, making important contacts with geographers and cartographers over there. He has a successful period abroad. He lectures, for example, to rapturous applause and acclaim at the University of Paris on Euclid's geometry. After that, he receives invitations. Henry II of France invites him to be the royal mathematician. Who else? Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, invites him to his court, and even Ivan the Terrible invites him to come to Moscow. Perhaps wisely, Dee declines the kind offers and returns to England, where he ends up working for various aristocrats, the Duke of Northumberland being one of them. He sets himself up as a teacher of mathematics and of navigation, and really becomes an instructor for some of the most well-known explorers of English history, the Frobishers, the Gilberts, Sir Walter Raleigh, and then the famous poet Sir Philip Sidney. So he always is moving around in court circles. I have to say though, it's not always that he's in good fortune. In 1555 he's imprisoned for doing a horoscope of Queen Mary. Mary accuses him of trying to enchant him and bring about her death. He's in prison. Fortunately he defends himself well and is released. But nevertheless, it's a sign of how his knowledge of occult arts like astrology can get him in trouble. Of course, I have to say, astrology was taught at university to physicians. Iatromathematics is all about the knowledge of astrology for the aid of medicine. That is illicit, but Dee, as soon as he casts someone's horoscope, is in danger of trying to find out illicit knowledge. For example, Mary probably was fearful that he was trying to find out the dates of her death, for example, or dates when she was most vulnerable. One example of a positive use of astrology recognition is when Queen Elizabeth, Elizabeth comes to power in 1558 after the death of Mary. She asks John Dee to choose the date of her coronation, which is, I hope, 15th of January 1559. So there's an example. It's called elective astrology. Dee chooses the best day for the Virgin Queen, who is a Virgo, yes, that's when she's crowned. And she becomes one of his patrons. Not always, I have to say, the most generous financially, but certainly intellectually supports him throughout his career. Even though Dee became a source of inspiration for some of his English fellows, including, for example, Ben Jonson, who took him rather satirically, possibly as the source, the inspiration for The Alchemist, subtle in the play The Alchemist, all about satirising practices of alchemy and the foolishness of patrons of alchemy. And William Shakespeare possibly used Dee as inspiration for Prospero in The Tempest, there as a righteous Magus who finally disowns his magic, drowns his staff and his book in the waters. Even though Dee, yes, has this impact on the English scene, he does spend time abroad. In the 1550s, he travels around Europe, attends the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian, but also in the 1580s, I mentioned these conversations with angels, these actions with spirits. In the 1580s, Dee leaves Mortlake, where he lives just outside London, and travels to the continent, and spends time at various important places, Kassel in the heartland of Germany, where he leaves some very well-known, very significant manuscripts. So one, the Berengarius manuscript of magic, which is fascinating. Work is now being finally done on that. He ends up at the court of Rudolf II, perhaps unwisely tells off the emperor. He says, "The angels have told me to say you've been a bad man and you need to improve your ways." Not surprisingly, Emperor Rudolf isn't hugely impressed by this, and he has to leave Prague fairly quickly. He's lucky though, because Emperor Rudolf's right-hand man, his second in command, Count Wilhelm Rosenberg, invites Dee down to South Bohemia, where the courts there of Český Krumlov and Červoň are magnets for occult philosophers on a similar, well, maybe not quite such a high level as with Rudolf II, but nevertheless important people go there. Dee, Edward Kelly with him goes there, Nicolas Barnot, a famous French alchemist, spends time there, and Heinrich Kunrad, whom I discussed in the first webinar, also spends time there. And a very productive time it was in many ways. Dee finally returns to England, unfortunately finds that his library has been pillaged and many of his precious books have disappeared, but carries on under the patronage of Queen Elizabeth until her death. Then has a more sticky time with King James, who is less impressed by the occult world. In fact, writes a book against demonology, really. But nevertheless, Dee carries on there, carries on practicing to a certain extent scrying with different scryers, different clairvoyants, and carries on practicing alchemy until his death in 1608, 1609. Although Dee claims to have been practicing alchemy from the age of 15 when he enters Cambridge University in 1542, really it's around 1556 that we find the first evidence of him really devoting himself to the study of alchemy. He lists an impressive 55 books that he claims to have read on alchemy that year. These include Geber, who is the most famous authority on practical laboratory alchemy. He's alleged author of the Summa Perfectionis, which is the most famous text in medieval laboratory alchemy, all about gold making. Dee's also particularly interested in texts attributed to the two Franciscans, Arnold of Villanova, the famous physician, who also has works of alchemy attributed to him, and also Ramon Llull. All the texts are pseudo-epigraphic, but they're hugely influential in the history of alchemy. Given the fact that Dee is nationalistic, it's not surprising to find that he's also extremely interested in English alchemists. One of these is Roger Bacon in the 13th century, another Franciscan. I mentioned him already, I showed you a page with his image on in Casaubon's True and Faithful Relation. There we have Roger Bacon. Not Francis, don't get confused. He's a famous natural philosopher who discusses the utility of alchemy, both in making gold and in medicines, in as early as the 13th century. Don't forget that alchemy was only really entering Western consciousness in the 12th century with translations from Arabic literature. So, yeah, Dee is reading his Roger Bacon, very impressed with Roger Bacon generally, is also interested in Thomas Norton, author of the Ordinal of Alchemy, and in George Ripley, 15th century canon of Bridlington in Yorkshire, very famous for the 12 Gates and other texts. If you're interested in George Ripley, you most definitely have to read Jenny Rampling's work. She's at the University of Cambridge and a historian of alchemy, specialist in Ripley. I should advertise actually that Jenny edited a collection of essays on John Dee last year, and if you hunt around on Google you'll find them. Really worthwhile reading. Hers is on John Dee and alchemy. There are others on Dee and astronomy and so forth, all thoroughly recommended. Okay, so who else? Yeah, 1556 then he's read these 55 works. 1557 he starts acquiring manuscripts and books. One of these, for example, is the Rosary or Rosarium Philosophorum, the Rosary of the Philosophers. This is a significant work. It's a florilegium, a collection of quotes from different alchemical authors, published in 1550, and it's important because it's one of the first image sequences in alchemy. The first of those was published in 1546, it's Petrus Bonus's New Pearl of Great Price, but the Rosary really enjoyed a great circulation. It was a huge influence right through the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and still impresses people now. Carl Jung, for example, based a lot of his psychoanalytic theory on his interpretation of images and text in the Rosary of the Philosophers. So Dee acquires this in 1557. He also acquires translations of Arabic material. For example, the Crowd of Philosophers, the Turba Philosophorum, is an Arabic text translated into Latin. He has that, or has extracts from it, and also he has works of Avicenna on alchemy as well. So he's reading around the subject, he's trying to get not just a familiarity with English literature, with Latin material, but clearly also he's interested in what the Arabs have to say. And we find, for example, in 1567 he acquires a Greek manuscript, which is the famous Greek collection, actually, of material translated by Berthelot in French. And that still survives in Kassel in Germany, in the archives there. Fascinating. Don't forget, Dee was a scholar, an underreader of Greek at Cambridge. This manuscript is all in Greek, it's got his notes there, and very interesting. You can see what type of alchemy he's interested in. If you read in the margins of many of his books or manuscripts that he's collected, he had something like 2,292, I think it was, books in his collection in 1583, in his catalogue, and 199 manuscripts. So he has the biggest private library in England, actually the biggest library at all in England, in 1583. Much of that is alchemy, and you can see that it's alchemy dealing with Latin material, Greek material, and in various languages, French and English as well. One of these I should point out to you, in 1559 he's given a book by an Italian, a Venetian who's resident in England, and this is a book that shows a different dimension of John Dee. Up to now he's been interested in properties of matter. For example, in some of the notes to some of his books you find he's interested in things like arsenic or cinnabar, which is the mineral made of mercury and sulphur, i.e. the two main ingredients of the philosopher's stone. As a mathematician he's showing interest in weights. So for example, you can find records where he's noted the weight of a substance before and after it's been purged. So there's a site of quantification there. He's even interested in the dimensions of the alchemical vessels. One thing I should point out, which shows a different direction from many other alchemists, is that he is interested in someone who writes a combination, really, attempts a combination of alchemy and Kabbalah. This is the Venetian priest Giovanni Agostino Panteo, who writes a book in 1530 called the Warka du Mia, in which he claims to be a Kabbalah of the metals. This is an experiment. It's a real combination of alchemical ideas and Kabbalistic ideas, on the assumption that the letters of the Hebrew alphabet each of them have a significance. They have a numeric significance, and they have other meanings as well. What Panteo does is he takes alchemical words, sometimes names of substances, sometimes processes, and he analyzes them numerically to try and find out secrets about them. In this, he's extremely original. He's the first person to have done that in the Christian West. Though I have to say, the 9th century Sufi alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan had done something similar in Arabic in his Book of the Balances. But nevertheless, Panteo in Venice is the first person to try it with Hebrew and alchemy, I mean Hebrew Kabbalah and alchemy. It's a curious experiment. Dee is given a copy of this book in 1559 by Giovanni Battista Agnello, a Venetian alchemist resident in London, and Dee's copy can still be seen in the British Library. If you go there, you can call it up and look at his notes. It's significant for other reasons as well. It's a combination of alchemy and Kabbalah, but it also has two magical alphabets that you see later in this text, in Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. You see an alphabet called the Transitus Fluvii, the crossing of the river, and you find John Dee trying to make calculations using that alphabet. For those of you interested in Enochian magic, it also has the Enochian alphabet there, as a very early publication in the West including it. Dee, of course, is fascinated by these things. He writes with delight about discovering the Steganographia of Johannes Tritemius, the magical abbot of Sponheim, who also publishes about magical alphabets and other alphabets. And I can imagine the delight that Dee had when he was given the book by Panteo. Anyway, it shows you a different dimension. It shows you someone who's not just practicing traditional gold making of the Middle Ages, but is branching out and looking for inspiration from other sources, including Kabbalah. You also get the sense, the intimation, that Dee is interested in combining astrology and alchemy as well. For our purposes, the first major publication of John Dee that we should be aware of is this text in a modern edition. If you're interested, John Dee on Astronomy. The text is the Propaedoimata Aphoristica, the aphoristic introduction basically to astronomy. This is the title page of the 1558 edition, and it already has evidence of a symbol, a hieroglyph, that was to become a major focus of John Dee's occult philosophy. So the title page here, we have, Aristotelian elements, as in calidum and humidum, hot and moist, for 2 of the qualities of matter. We also have 2 of the 4 elements, earth and water, at the bottom. We have the sun and the moon. This is a work on astronomy, but it's a work on astronomy and astrology. It's how cosmic rays influence matter in the sublunar region, in the human terrestrial realm. Both matter and human beings. One of the metaphors that John Dee uses here is that the cosmos is like a lyre, the musical instrument, the lyre, and that each string represents a different species of creation. And you can see rays coming down from, well, from everywhere in the cosmos, in particular from the sun and moon, the 2 most influential planets in the cosmos, planets in the astrological sense. Their beams coming down to the centre of this circle here, all of them sort of constellating there. This represents the Earth, the terrestrial centre, which suggests a sort of geocentric approach, I have to say, rather than heliocentric. It's not Copernican so much as Ptolemaic. And what is this circle the centre of? It's the centre of his hieroglyphic monad, which is something that he develops in a later publication. Here, though, we have the first version of it, and for those of you who know your astrology, you'll immediately recognise that's the planet Mercury here, the moon, circle for the sun, and then the cross, and there at the bottom is the first sign of the zodiac, the fire sign Aries. It's a combination of, star sign and planet here, but what Dee tells us is, here in a scroll on one side of his symbol, is that Stilbon, that's the Greek word for the planet Mercury, meaning the shining or the glimmering one, Stilbon with a sting is like all the planets. The sting is the planet, is the zodiac sign Aries, and there's Mercury or Stilbon at the top. And this is something that he develops in his later work, the Monas Hieroglyphica, we'll look at next, where this symbol encapsulates all of the planets and all of the metals. Okay, what else have we got here? ID, or JD for John Dee, a symbol of authorship there, and also we have a very telling phrase on this side, in this scroll here. It says, in the monad is whatever the wise seek. Yeah. Anyone who knows that phrase in Latin will know, actually, if they know their alchemy, that there's a famous alchemical phrase, in Mercury is whatever the wise men seek. So John Dee here really, for his readers who know their alchemy, is paraphrasing it and saying that his monad is his Mercury, is intimating that the 2 of them are interchangeable here. Mercury in all senses. Mercury in the sense of the planet Mercury for the astronomers, in the metal quicksilver, or philosophical Mercury to be more exact for alchemists, and possibly also Mercury of Mercurius or Hermes Trismegistus, the main inspiration for Hermetic philosophy, as a combination there. What else have we got? We have not just these sort of enigmatic Hermetic statements, but also we have a biblical statement from Luke. Let there be the sun and the moon, let the sun and the moon and the stars be signs in the sky. A sort of biblical scriptural legitimization of the practice of astronomy and astrology. And at the top, an indication of John Dee's rather possible irritable nature, that he who doesn't understand either shut up or learn. Yeah, the gainsayers who criticise him have to keep quiet, or they actually have to pay attention and learn something new. And he really is suggesting something new here. In these 120 aphorisms, he's discussing how one should pay attention to and try and quantify planetary influences. And it's very much a combination of astronomy and alchemy and astrology. So, 1558 sees the publication of John Dee's book on astronomy, the Permutations Aphoristica. I mentioned that on the title page, and actually also inside the book, there's a reference to this hieroglyphic monad. This is something that germinates in John Dee's mind. In fact, it takes him around 7 years for it to finally come to fruit. It comes to fruit in Antwerp in 1564 in the Monas Hieroglyphica. This is probably John Dee's best known work, and also undoubtedly his most puzzling work. Here is a title page from the 1564 edition. Now, we have the same symbol of the hieroglyphic monad, slightly more subtle than on the 1558 edition. Dee says that this is the child that was conceived in London and was born in Antwerp. Why was it published in Antwerp? It's because he couldn't find a publisher that was a printer that could cope with his demands in London. So he travels over to the continent, to a place where he'd already spent time when he was younger. Willem Sylvius is the person who publishes the book. Asking why, it's curious. One thing that might be an indication is that the previous year in 1563, Sylvius had published a well-known emblem book by Claude Paradin on emblematic devices. A beautiful edition. You can find it on Google Books if you go and look, and it's full of symbolic material that will appeal to anyone who has a sort of hieroglyphic or emblematic worldview. John Dee calls this, of course, his hieroglyphic monad, so he really is in that world where emblems, symbols, hieroglyphs are acutely important. And we've already had this with Heinrich Kunrat. We've also had something similar in the emblematic alchemy of Michael Meyer. This, though, is different. John Dee is not really into figurative art. He's into symbols or glyphs, yeah. And the Monas hieroglyph, or hieroglyphic monad, is his best known instance of that. If we look at the title page, it's very similar to the Permutations Aphoristica. It's got the same slightly irritated expression at the top: if you don't understand, shut up or learn. At the bottom we have a biblical phrase again, and it's from the dew of heaven and from the fat of the earth God gives to you, from Genesis. For anyone interested in alchemy, immediately the dew of heaven and the fat of the earth symbolise two different substances of the philosopher's stone. The dew of heaven is mercury and the fat of the earth is sulphur, those two components of medieval gold making. What else can I tell you here? We've got the same sun and the moon as we had on the other title page. We've got fire and air at the top and then earth and water at the bottom for the four elements. We have an egg-shaped container for philosophical mercury, for the hieroglyphic monad. This symbol again is made up of Mercury at the top and Aries at the bottom. Now, anyone who knows their astrology will know that Aries is the first sign of the zodiac. For some alchemists, they actually symbolically or literally said, you begin with Aries. Aries can either mean you begin with fire, because fire is the first instrument of alchemy, or you actually literally begin the alchemical process at the beginning of, well, the 21st of March, which is the beginning of the sign of Aries. Or it could be an indicator of a substance. Aries in alchemy symbolises Mars and iron, the metal iron, and maybe you begin with something with that quality. There are many different interpretations. Dee, though, is very much aware of the fact that Mercury symbolises philosophical Mercury, which is water, and Aries symbolises fire, and fire and air water together again recall a well-known alchemical adage, ignis et azoth tibi sufficient, let fire and azoth, which is philosophical Mercury, be sufficient for you. So here in one symbol you've got the fire and the azoth combined in his monad. Okay, what else can I say about this? Anyone interested in astrology will immediately recognise signs for the first 4 elements of the zodiac. John Dee, born 13th of July, is a Cancer. Well, there we have Cancer, water sign at the top, and if you look carefully you'll see, okay, Aries and Taurus, and Gemini, the 2 twins, and Cancer, which means that you've got the 4 elements of traditional Aristotelian physics. Aries represents fire, Taurus represents earth, Gemini, the 2 twins, represents air, and Cancer represents water. So you've got a constellation of a lot of symbols going on there. You've also got scrolls saying, okay, okay, Stilbon again, so the Greek word for the planet Mercury. Stilbon with a hook is the king of all the planets. Yeah, similar to what we have in the Permutations Aphoristica. This idea that Mercury with a hook, which means with the Aries at the bottom of it, represents all the planets and all the metals. Actually, planets and metals sort of equated here. John Dee, when he's discussing his hieroglyphic monad, explains that it's mathematically, magically, kabbalistically and anagogically explained. Okay, which immediately tells the reader, in fact it tells Maximilian II, the emperor to whom he dedicates this book, that he's working on different levels. It is about mathematics, yes it is, just as the Permutations Aphoristica is. In fact it begins with the creation of his of everything basically from a point that becomes a line, that becomes a circle, and this becomes one of the this geometrical idea becomes one of the fundamental principles for his symbol of the hieroglyphic monad. What sort of things do we have? Okay, on a mathematical level we've got the geometry, but also we have a Kabbalistic dimension to it. Now the Kabbalah I mentioned he'd already got interested in through reading Giovanni Pantheo's Warka du Mia, which gets a name check in here, Warka du Mia. And he's very interested in that. What he does though is he takes it in a different direction. Instead of Kabbalah generally is seen as a Jewish tradition translated as reception Kabbalah, a way of exegesis, a way of interpreting text, scriptural text, where you have different methods for interpreting what's there on the page. One of these is gematria, where you take any letter in the Hebrew alphabet has a number value to it. You take a word, you calculate its value, and that calculation will give you some idea of the essence of its meaning. And the very fact that one word and another word might have the same numeric value suggests there's a relationship between them. That's gematria. Another method is sort of acronyms, where you've things like BBC, where the BBC is British Broadcasting Corporation, but the individual letters are given instead, and that opens things up to different interpretations. You can take a normal word and read every individual letter of it as representing new words. The third type that John Dee is interested in, after Gematria and Notariakon, is Temura or Tziruf, which is permutations of letters, where you might take one alphabet and replace the standard alphabet of Hebrew with a permutation of it. The best known example is where you take, instead of the letter letter Aleph at the beginning, you write the letter Taf, which is at the very end. So you substitute the beginning and the ends of the alphabet for each other. John Dee is aware of that and its use in Hebrew. But actually what he's propounding in the Monas Hieroglyphica is not what he calls the Kabbalah of the spoken or of the word, but a Kabbalah of the real, a Kabbalah of nature. And this is taking things in a different direction. One thing he's doing is he's universalizing the ideas of Kabbalah, the interpretive approaches of Kabbalah, but instead of just saying it's textual, he's saying nature itself is a book as well. The book of nature is what I'm interested in. And this is where the alchemy comes in. Instead of permutating letters or permutating his symbol of the monas, he's permutating the elements of creation and permutating substances, of course, in the search for the philosopher's stone. So that's a different level of reading. The symbol of that, I should go back to it, is his hieroglyphic monad. There, as I said, we begin with it being the sign for the symbol Mercury and the zodiac sign Aries. Okay, if you look at that, for Dee it's highly significant. Why is Mercury the king of all the planets? It's because it contains the glyphs of all the other planets in the Ptolemaic cosmos inside it. It's the only astrological or astronomical glyph that has the sun and the moon combined. So you've got the moon at the top, you've got the sun there as the circle, and then you've got the cross underneath it. Now, and he argues that, okay, if you remove the sign for Aries and the moon, you've got the sign for Venus. If you rotate this, you've got the sign for the planet Mars. If you remove the sign for moon and sun, you've got, on one side, you've got the sign for the planet Saturn, on the other side, his modified or reformed version of the planet Jupiter. So basically, you've got the whole Ptolemaic cosmos inside this, contained in, encapsulated in this one glyph. And he bases his ideas on that. These are permutations of substances or of glyphs, both to be read on that different level. One on a speculative level, where you can start probably generating other glyphs from this to represent other alchemical substances or processes, but also you should carry that out in matter itself. This sounds bizarre, but it's quite surprising that Andreas Libavius, a 16th century alchemist who radically opposes most occult practices, who really doesn't approve of John Dee, doesn't approve of Paracelsus, with this idea of a glyph that actually is generative, that provides the source for other symbols in alchemy, he really approves of it. He thinks it's a one way of standardizing something that transcends language. It can be used in different languages. Anyone who knows this glyph can understand what's going on if you write it down. So it's interesting. It's a sort of universal scientific notation that John Dee is trying to develop, and he gets unlikely sympathizers. Another instance of what this Monas represents for John Dee is a nice image here where he has, okay, the sign for Aries at the bottom of as I've mentioned several times, but also he's pointing out that the sign at the top can also be read as the sign Taurus. If Aries is the first sign of the zodiac, the first fire sign, then Taurus is the first earth sign. The two of them together are very significant for anyone doing astrology, in that the planet, the sun, okay, normally the sun is the ruler of Leo, but it's exalted, it's at its highest power in the sign Aries. Okay, the sun, don't forget, in alchemy represents gold. The moon is normally the ruler of the planet of the sign Cancer, but it's exalted at its highest power in the sign Taurus. So here, this combination of, I have to say, Taurus plus Aries represents the exaltations of the moon and the exaltations of the sun. If you're interested in alchemy and you're trying to create the philosopher's stone, which is a combination of these two principles, then that symbol again represents the sort of the perfection of the philosopher's stone. And really, this is something that gets played out again and again in the 24 aphorisms which make up the 33 pages of the Monas Hieroglyphica, is this combination of different levels of reading, astrological or Kabbalistic levels of reading. And here we have definitely the Philosopher's Stone intimated there, and more literally we get it in one of the later aphorisms in the book, where he actually quotes from the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, the famous line which actually I've mentioned, I think, both in the Kunrad and in the Michael and Meyer presentation, where its father is the sun, its mother is the moon, the wind bore it in its belly, and the earth is its nurse. Here we've got the father, sun, the mother moon combined. And what, if you remember the Emerald Tablet, it's the mysteries of the one thing. And the one thing is the monas. Don't forget, monas means one. John Dee, in his mathematical preface, really emphasizes this, that it means the unit. Yeah, the one thing. So really, the Monas hieroglyph that we've been talking about in the centre of this egg shape here is, for all intents and purposes, the Philosopher's Stone on an alchemical level. Okay, I said that this work was mathematically, kabbalistically, magically and anagogically explained. Briefly, on a magical level, John Dee mentions scrying again. He talks about crystals and the idea of gazing into crystals for getting angelic communication. That's included there on a magical level. There also is reference to the gamma hair. Now, gamma hair is something that's introduced by Paracelsus in his works, and it's a combination of alchemy and magic. A gamma hair on some levels is translated literally as a sort of cameo. Some people think it might actually be a fossil. It's an image appearing in nature, but what it is basically is a sort of talisman which is imbued with astrological energies. The best instances of those are usually the metals. They're seen as the best receptors or containers of astral influences. So we have that level as well. But before I sort of conclude this, I'm aware that I've missed out many things, such as Pythagorean ideas of symbolic geometry, the symbolism of 1, 2, 3, 4, that it adds up to 10, which is the symbol of perfection in Pythagoras. What I should say is the anagogical meaning is important. If you are aware of the 4 levels of interpretation in traditional religious texts, the 4 levels of exegesis, you've got the literal level, which is the sort of history of what happens. You've got the allegorical level telling you what you should believe. You've got the tropological or moral level telling you what you should do. And then you've got the anagogical level, which is telling you where you will go. Now, in scripture, that's often talking about the kingdom of heaven. Where something that can mean the church on one level means Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem on another level. John Dee says that this is also anagogically explained, and there it's suggesting a different dimension. Even though I've been giving you a story of John Dee as someone who's discussed alchemy as the transmutation of impure metals into silver and gold, in this text as well, there is one diagram which is called, let me see if I can find it for you quickly, it is called the Tree of Rarity, the Arbor Raritatis. And that is suggesting that someone who pays attention to the monad, who even feeds the monad, as John Dee puts it, will actually themselves yes, sort of transform or metamorphose onto higher levels of existence. And he even argues that they will attain the invisibility of the magi. So there is a suggestion. Nicholas Cluley, who's one of the major authorities on John Dee, if you've not read John Dee Between Science and Magic, you really should read it. In this Arbor Raritatis, John Dee very modestly suggests that his monas should be placed at the lowest level of this tree of rarity, but at the same time it's the person who pays attention to this. Here's a sort of Pythagorean why. If they take the broad path, they head towards the Greek word tyrannos, so sort of power and tyranny in the sort of negative sense. If they take the fine path, they head toward the Greek word pneumatikos, the spiritual being, the spiritual person. And this is clearly what he's indicating. The adept who pays attention to the secrets and deciphers the secrets in this enigmatic text, the Monas Hieroglyphica, is heading in the direction of the pneumatikos, the spiritual being. And this is the tropological, sorry, not tropological, the anagogical level of reading, where there's a personal transformation going on as well as a transformation of things in the macrocosm outside man. It's a text that is puzzling. Brian Vickers has said it's one of the most obscure books published in the probably history of publishing. I have to say I do agree with him. It's an enigmatic text. John Dee explained it to Queen Elizabeth I, and she confessed that she still wasn't much the wiser in many ways. That being said, it became a source of inspiration for many people. I've already mentioned in the first of these webinars that in 1589 John Dee and Heinrich Kunrat met each other. Kunrat clearly was inspired by Dee, and in two of the engravings which I showed in webinar 1, you will find the presence of John Dee's hieroglyphic monad. This is the alchemical citadel with one true entrance. You enter it passing Hermes Trismegistus, who's here, and you go through this arch. At the top of the arch there are two dragons biting each other's tails, and inside that, if you look very carefully, you'll see John Dee's hieroglyphic monad. That's one symbol, and there is the other well-known image. You can go and look at the University of Wisconsin website. They have a beautiful coloured version of this. It's Kunrat's most alchemical image, and if you remember, okay, here's the bird of Hermes. It's the alchemical bird, which is a composite of different birds. On the raven's belly you find the word azot, as I mentioned too, meaning philosophical mercury. If you look at the O of the word azot very carefully with a magnifying glass, you'll see that that O is John Dee's hieroglyphic monad. So clearly there, in Kunrat at least, you've got someone who's reading this on an alchemical level, yeah, as a symbol for the combination of superior astronomy, by which he means astrology, and inferior astronomy, astronomia inferior, which doesn't mean worse or lower, it just means low on the sense of it's terrestrial. And Dee's monas encapsulates that. As a final thing to mention, we are in the Ritman Library. It's a Rosicrucian library. I should mention The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz. Okay, here we are, published in 1616, and the story is that Christian Rosenkreutz is there in his study. An angelic being comes and gives him a letter, an invitation to the chemical wedding, and what is on that invitation but none other than John Dee's hieroglyph. I think that's probably a good place to end. I hope you found it stimulating. I'm sure you are aware I've missed out so much information on all three of these presentations. I hope that's an encouragement that maybe I can go on and do others of these in the future, or that you get in touch with me, and I hope to enjoy an exchange of ideas about these texts and other material which is around in this wonderful library. Okay. That is the third and final webinar by me. The next one will be by my colleague and friend Wouter Hanegraaf, who will be giving 3 presentations on his take on esoteric works in the Ritman Library. Thank you very much.